Hi friends, I'm Jeffy G. I'm back with something quite interesting and different. The creation of new concepts for music synthesis don't happen very often, and it's tough to break into the market. The trusted and true methods are more evolutionary than they are revolutionary. The most popular forms started with oscillators, there's additive, subtractive, there's FM synthesis or linear FM, there's waveform driven or wavetable, and there's sample based. And over the last few years, there's been a lot of hype around spectral and granular synthesis. Today, there are some virtual synths that can combine 8 or more of those sample methods with 4 sound generators, all in combination. But the 3 in this video are special and unique as they've tried to introduce new methods of sound synthesis. It's tough to be a trailblazer. If you're going to cut a new path, you have to hold down the grass all by yourself. I've tried a lot of synthesizers over the years, but my perspective always started as a musician playing live gigs. So naturally, I bought a lot of physical synths that I would take to a show. I switched to using Mainstage for my live performances and using virtual synths instead of those physical ones. The point is, I'm not really a synthesis expert. Do I know the basics of oscillators and filters and LFOs and envelopes? Yes. And can I modify the modulation to make the synth do what I want? Yes. The first one we're going to look at is by Native Instruments, and it's called Form. It's a reactor-built instrument that is sample-based, but it goes beyond sample source to applying motion and speed in terms of curves, and those curves are the form. Now, Native Instruments calls it a transformative tracking sample synthesizer. And I think part of the issue is they came out with this in 2016, 2017, and never do they mention granular or grains in the description, even though the methods of picking the sound sources is pretty much the same as granular synthesis. It's made up of multiple pages. The first page is a sample page where you can load in a sample, and it shows you a curve that's being interpreted as the pitch curve. You can view the pitch curve or turn it off. But essentially, Form is analyzing the sample for pitch changes. Now, the thing you'll notice is the motion, which is defined by this curve down here, and the speed with which the playing or the execution of that sample takes place. It can be based on BPM, which is relative to your DAW, the sample length itself, or hertz, or manually. And this is the curve that's being executed. If you take a look at the curve in the curve editor, you'll see there's a region here that's being looped. And the details of how that loop is executed are down here. Whether it goes back and forth or forward and back, those are all options here. And you can define how big this loop area is. Now, if I turn off the loop, I can play the entire sample. You can see that last little hump and drop changes the volume. Then there's a sound page. And this is where you can add other oscillators to your sample sound. There's something called a form oscillator. This piece in the middle shows you how the oscillator effects are being applied. You can add formant. There is an additive oscillator, another one, and sometimes you can make this an octave higher or lower, and you can change the waveform and the volume of those pieces. There's a modulation section here. Any of these features, like let's say we turn up this FM feature. If you hover over these things, you can assign them to anything in the modulation area. So let's say I choose LFO1 and assign that particular control to LFO1. Then the rate, wave, and feedback, all the parameters for the modulation will apply. Okay, the last page is the effects page. And there's some pretty cool effects here. There is a 2-band frequency shaper. You can control the degree to which your frequency shaping influences the outcome of the sound. There's a warmth piece, which is really a little bit of a distortion drive, and you can control the parameters for that. You'll see there's different types of warmth, digital, tube, whether it applies to individual bands or all. Then there's dynamics, which is really a compressor. And you can control the attack release delay of that compressor. This delay can have a ping pong effect. And there's a reverb. And there's a bunch of options on the reverb: small, medium, large, cheap, unreal. So you've got these 3 pages: the sample, sound enhancements, and the effects. The presets are organized into individual types of instruments, and you can browse through those on your own. But there is one called init form, and this is where you start, where you would drag or drop a sample into it. So I'm just going to pull up a sample. I'm going to use this sample called Ice Trinkets. Drag that in. You can preview it. Or, well, if you like it, you click on load. And you can see Form has interpreted a pitch curve. It sees all of these changes as pitch. And you can adjust what part of the sample you want to use. And I can change how fast I want the motion to execute. And then I can change the curve. So I can choose a preset, of which there are many, or I could create my own curve. If we take a look at what's happening with this particular curve, it's going to play forward and then go back. This one has more of a looping section. One of the undo buttons here is to reset the sound. If I click on reset, it asks me to confirm. I'm back where I started. Now, I can add things to the sound here with one of these oscillators. So for example, if I want an additional oscillator that's 2 octaves higher, you can hear that kicking in. I can add FM. I've got options to add formant. Then over to my effects, I can turn on some reverb, maybe make that large. Last thing I can do is I have this area called Perform down here where I can assign 12 different keys on my keyboard to execute different combinations. So if I click on the first spot, so I can have one set of presets for the first slot, and I can have maybe just reverb in the second. With Form, the emphasis isn't so much on the sound source, which is interesting, but it's on the application of speed, and motion, and how you manage the motion that make the sounds unique. And maybe that wasn't clearly understood by the marketplace. You might be inclined to think, can't you do all of that with modulation? And the answer is no, not to this degree, and not in the way it's done in Form. Now, Sculpture comes delivered in Logic. It's not available outside of the Logic DAW, so it's one of the virtual instruments they deliver. Whereas Forms that we looked at earlier is available from Native Instruments independently. You can buy it on its own, or you can buy it in a bundle. Sculpture is called a physical modeling synthesis. It simulates an acoustic instrument like plucking a string or bowing a string on a violin or blowing across an object like a glass. That striking of a string creates a vibration across two pickups. Then there's an ADSR envelope and a wave shaper. After that, it's very much like any other additive or subtractive synth. I've selected to recall the default. In the middle is the area where you pick the material. That's kind of the first step. Got wood, glass, steel, and nylon. Then you can pick the amount of polyphony. Right now it's set to 8. You can change that if you wanted to, say 6, like a guitar would have 6 strings. Or you can click on these fast keys for mono and legato. There are 3 objects that determine how that sound is played. We're going to start with object 1. There are 8 methods to stimulate the starting of that string vibrating. We're going to go with strike. For the demo, we're going to turn off the delay, the EQ, and the filter. Once you've determined the method for causing that string to vibrate, this picture here is a representative of 2 pickups. There's one here, and one here. You can determine where those pickups are, much like you would on a guitar. So one near the bridge, one in the middle. Then you can decide where each one of the objects falls. So if you want object 1 to be close to that pickup, it's going to sound different than if it's back here, or midway between the pickups. Object number 2, slightly different. In addition to those methods, you've actually got 15 that include noise and disturb. So for example, you could add some noise and then determine where that fits on how close to a pickup. There are options here on whether you want object 2 to make its impact when the key is pressed on or always. And there's object 3. Object 3 has a few more variations here. Let's choose the dampening, which would be kind of a muted sound. You can hear that initial plucking is somewhat muted with object 3 in play. Then in the middle, you've got things that control the amount of harmonics. Turn down that resolution. You You get almost no harmonics. Turn it up. You get more. Two other controls you have are the media loss, which effectively impacts the sustain, and the tension of the string. If you increase the tension too high, the string doesn't sound. After creating a basic sound, you can choose EQ. There are dials for the low, medium, and high, or you can choose these presets. There's a delay and a filter. Most of the controls can all be assigned to modulation. There's two LFOs, LFO 1 and 2, something called jitter, a vibrato, a velocity for on-off, and then an A-B controller. We'll take a different material, turn off these effects. Just starting with object 1, instead of strike, we're going to choose blow. In object 2, we're going to turn on and add some noise to make it sound airy. Object 3, we're going to turn that on, change that to disturb 2. A little bit too much. Without going over everything that Sculpture can do, that's just kind of a quick overview. The next synthesizer in our analysis is the Knif Knifonium, which is a virtual instrument by Brainworx, emulating a 26 vacuum tube handmade synthesizer. The actual synthesizer it's based on is this, and there's about a 2-year waiting list to get one of these. They're handcrafted, and they sell for a whopping $18,000 or more. So the virtual instrument is much more attainable than the original. And in my case, I was able to get this included in a special deal with Native Instruments Complete 14. So let's take a look at what makes this synthesizer so unique. Let's take a quick look at how this thing works. There's a button up at the top here. If you click on it, you get this extra layer. It has an effects band where you can choose or apply different effects. There's an arpeggiator, does pretty much what you would expect. And then there are some options here. The Knifonium is really the second synth from Brainworx after their BX Oberhausen synth. If you've taken a look at that before, you'll know essentially how these things are laid out. But it's important to keep in mind that the original Knifonium hardware device is a monophonic synth. When you click on the options here, you can see you have the option of making it polyphonic, so you can have up to 8 voices. There's a unison mode you can turn off and on, and there's TMT, which is tolerance modeling technology, on each voice. There's also a way to manage your presets. Looks something like this. It has a browser where you can narrow down your choices and pick a preset, or you can save your own presets. There are 2 oscillators, VCO1 and VCO2. VCO1 has several different waveforms you can choose from, including a pulse, whereas VCO2 does not have the pulse setting. So there's slight differences between the 2 VCOs. There is a sync mode for keeping both oscillators in sync. Up at the top here, you'll see a mixer section where you can control the volume of the oscillators, the ring modulator, and a noise source. Below that, there is a filter, VCF filter, pretty much what you would expect. And below that is the ring modulator, the controls for the ring modulator. There is one LFO off to the right. There are 2 envelopes, and there is a output master amplifier on the lower right. What makes this synth unique is that every circuit has tubes that can be overdriven, so gain staging impacts the resulting sound. It's at a very primitive level where today most synthesizers will have effects to add saturation or other overdrive type effects. This particular synth generates that saturation automatically because of the use of tubes. That is what makes its synthesis method unique. Sometimes the results can be a bit weird and unpredictable, unlike a mini Moog, which is much more predictable. There is modulation on each one of the oscillators. This little grid over here lets you choose settings for the envelope, the LFO. It does have pitch modulation, stereo spread, and features that you wouldn't find on the hardware that have been built into the VST. In some ways, it is a traditional looking synthesizer from many years ago, but because it is based on these tubes, you do get unpredictable and interesting results, which you can hear in the presets. Well, doing the research for this video took a lot longer than I thought. Maybe tackling 3 unique synthesizers was a little bit too much. But I think all 3 are really good examples of different synthesis methods that have been tried over the years. Some of them successful, some of them not so successful. Personally, I really like some of the sounds in forms and sculpture, and given that the Knifonium is pretty new, I'm having a great time understanding the intricacies of a tube-driven synthesizer in its digital form. To me, that's a little bit ironic, but the sounds that come out of it are really amazing. It's fun to play with. If this is the kind of stuff that interests you, perhaps as a sound designer, I'd encourage you to get these, take a look at them, play around with them, and look at the trial versions. I think you'll find they're quite different than most of the popular synths that are out there. I hope you found the instructional parts of this video quite insightful. It does teach you a lot about these different synthesis methods, and if you're like me and you're not really into sound design yet, this is a good introduction. If this is the kind of content you'd like to see more of, leave me a comment, click on the like button, and consider subscribing to the channel.
Let's change the curve. Turn off the loop.
I'm Jeffy G. Thanks for watching.